Welcome. Hello. My name is Robert Parkinson, and on behalf of my mother Jane and my sister Susan, I want to welcome you to a long overdue celebration of the life of my father, Jerry Parkinson. In normal times, we would be gathering together in person a few days after Jerry passed in September 2020, but these are not normal times. We had planned on holding a virtual service on the anniversary of Dad's passing this past fall, but at that time, we were up to our eyeballs in selling a house in Williamsburg and buying one for Mom in Texas and getting her packed up, and it was a pretty difficult time. So we decided to wait until January. Next week would have been Dad's 83rd birthday, so Susan and I thought this would be a good time to gather as much as we can. There is one silver lining to waiting. Over the past year, we have heard from lots of unexpected folks about how much Jerry meant to them. Reactions and responses we couldn't have known and related had we done this immediately after Dad's passing. Apparently, Dad left quite an impression on the Williamsburg community. As we had people come to the house to do work in quite the normal course of business, they were bereft when they found out that Jerry was gone. People like garage door repairmen and appliance repairmen and the exterminator. People who we never really would have thought would remember Dad. I mean, some of these people hadn't been to the house in years, still felt an attachment to him. They recalled his asking questions about their lives and taking an interest in them and treating them like equals. And this was an important part of how Jerry lived his life, a theme we will return to over the course of this service. Being kind and welcoming to others was important to him, and it showed. So here is a rundown of how things will proceed this evening. We'll begin with a prayer from Reverend Dr. Brian Bachnight, former senior minister at Christ United Methodist Church in Bethel Park, PA, the church where Jane and Jerry were married and would later be members and lay leaders. The Bachnights became close family friends, and it is appropriate to start things with comforting words from Brian. Then his granddaughter, Abby Parkinson, will read the 23rd Psalm, Jerry's favorite Bible verse. I will then give the eulogy, followed by video messages of remembrance from his brother Don and Williamsburg neighbor Laura Walter. Several friends and families have submitted written remembrances of Jerry, and his granddaughters and I have recorded readings of them. We will end with a video montage of photographs of Jerry through the years. The piano music that accompanies this is titled Solace, written by Scott Joplin. It's featured in Jerry's favorite film, The Sting, and the mood seems perfect accompaniment for what we are gathered here to do. It is a tone of bittersweetness, or as his granddaughter Carly would say, it's happy sad. I will return at the end for a word of closing. So thank you for attending this celebration of a life we wished had lasted a lot longer.
Thank you, Rob. I arrived at a new church assignment in the South Hills of Pittsburgh in the fall of 1980, about the same time that the Parkinson family moved to Pittsburgh. They very quickly became active members and participants in the life of the church. And that year also began a friendship for my wife and I with them that extends now over more than 40 years. I invite you as we begin this memorial service tonight to join me in an opening prayer. Let us pray together. Gracious God, loving God, we gather here to remember with thanksgiving Jerry, one of your faithful children. We thank you for his life and witness, and for his love for you and the Christian journey. We thank you for the sure and certain hope of eternity, which is far more than we can know or think or even imagine. We thank you for the special means which allow us to join in this service tonight from so many places around the country. And we thank you for all the ways Jerry's life touched each one of us, as a husband, as a father, a grandfather, and a friend. Be with us as we join in worship and remembrance at this time. May all that is said and read honor you and remember Jerry well. We pray this with confidence and with thanksgiving. Amen.
This is the 23rd Psalm. It was Poppy's favorite Bible verse. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Jerry Lee Parkinson was born on January 19th, 1939, at Washington Hospital in Washington, Pennsylvania, to Raynor and Eleanor Parkinson. He would be the oldest of four. Dawn, Margaret or Peggy, and Carol came after. Being the firstborn, the biggest brother, always meant a great deal to Dad, and he over the years developed lots of theories about birth order, and it always turned out in his mind that the oldest kid was somehow always the most responsible and favored child. I wonder why. He told lots of stories about his grandparents' farm at Kirby, PA, and about the quiet stoicism and toughness of his grandfather, John Edward Parkinson. One of my favorite stories was about an obstinate horse who decided he would step on John Edwards' foot. As Dad told the story, his grandfather calmly told the horse to get off his foot. He told him once, and the horse didn't move. He told him twice, and the horse still did nothing. So he punched him once right behind the front leg so hard that the horse fell down, and he never stepped on his foot ever again. Dad had a particular way of telling this story, and lots of stories about his time on the farm. He especially talked about the amazing strength of John Edwards' hands. He would show the strength of his hands by inflicting on young Jerry a pinch right behind his left knee as a sign of affection, which must have been formative for Dad because I was the recipient of many of these same pinches in the passenger seat of the car, and I have passed this down to my girls in a move that is now known as a Poppy Special. I was almost named John Edward, but instead they made me RGP, changing Raynor Glenn to Robert Glenn. The honor of John Edward went to my cousin, born a month after me. Dad attended Waynesburg High School, where he met Jane Price. At the chalkboard, he used his height to look down at her notebook to get the answers right in Algebra 2 class. His height was good for making the basketball team at Waynesburg High, but also bad in that Mr. Gray forced him to play the tuba rather than the trumpet as he wanted to in the marching band, so sort of against his will. Park Oldsmobile and Pontiac, the car dealership that his father ran in Waynesburg, was another institution of his youth, as it was for all the Parkinson children. I don't know how many cars he washed for his father's store, but it must have been a lot, because he had a very precise way of washing cars, a very, very strict procedure about how this was supposed to go down the right way. He graduated in Waynesburg High in 1956, which he would definitely want you to know was a year early because he skipped the second grade. And he went first to Waynesburg College. He would follow Jane and go on to major in business administration at Penn State, where he graduated technically in 1962, but really in the class of 61, with a fun last-minute credit snafu made him unable to fully graduate in the same class with Mom. Immediately after college, he got a very prestigious job working at the New York office of Oldsmobile at Columbus Circle in Midtown Manhattan. Mom and Dad were married at Christ United Methodist Church in Bethel Park, PA on August 4th, 1962. Mom and Dad would spend all of the 1960s in New York, a really perfect time to be in the city at the center of the world, especially with a free and dedicated parking spot in the GM garage. Mom recently told me that all they had to do was pay the 75-cent toll on the George Washington Bridge if they wanted to get into the city to see anything, and Sue and I found, lately, some pretty fantastic playbills from Broadway shows for those years. Dad was also in the Army Reserve at this time. He did basic training at Fort Knox, served at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, and was stationed at Fort Dix in New Jersey. He was lieutenant in a company that administered basic training for incoming draftees and volunteers from 1962 to 1968, which meant by the end he saw a great deal of boys who were headed for Vietnam. They moved out to the New Jersey suburbs in 1967 and buying their first house in Hohokus. Mom taught in the Ridgewood schools, and Dad fought the Cross Bronx Expressway on his way to work on Long Island. But he did all sorts of different work for Oldsmobile during these years, including one bout of being a repo man. After the Miracle Mets won the World Series in 1969, all the players got free Oldsmobiles to drive for a year. A few of the players were unwilling to give their cars back, so on Halloween 1970, Dad had to go repossess some cars from members of some of the Mets pitching staff. Susan came along in 1969, and then myself in 1973, right before their first move. When I was 3 months old, Dad was transferred to the Oldsmobile home office in Lansing, Michigan, where he would be from 1973 to 1976. Then off to Boston, where he was assistant zone manager for Oldsmobile. They were there for the bicentennial and the Tall Ships Gala in Boston Harbor, for which I, as the future historian of the American Revolution, was the primary beneficiary. And they were there for the blizzard of 1978, when Dad almost didn't make it home from work. The snow was falling so hard and so fast. He took a sled to the grocery store to carry home food on foot, which is a story that Susan and I both wished we had asked more details about. Like, did you take the sled into the store? Did you, lean it up against the side? Were there other sleds? There's a lot of questions that still remain from this incident. In 1980, Dad was promoted to zone manager and was sent to Pittsburgh. And this was the highlight of his career for many reasons. One, it was home. He knew Pittsburgh. He'd been to Forbes Field and seen Roberto Clemente throw out a runner at home plate from the warning track, which is still something that makes me super jealous. And the Steelers had just won their 4th Super Bowl and the Pirates the World Series when we went there. This was the city of champions as we came back. Along with Nittany Lion football, these were dear to his heart. Raynor had already sold Park Olds by this time, so he wasn't going to be directly managing his father. But he got to be around lots of people who were familiar with the Parkinsons. Raynor's health declined rapidly during the early 1980s, and this was another way to be around and with his father. He also got to meet 2 Pittsburgh icons, Terry Bradshaw and Arnold Palmer. He was instrumental in setting up Palmer's dealership in Latrobe and got to play golf with him a few times as well. The second reason why Pittsburgh was a highlight was that it was a significant challenge. Pittsburgh was in a pretty bad way in 1980. The mills were shutting down if they hadn't already, and it was a tough time and place to sell cars. He would revisit these years a lot when he remembered his career. 2 weeks before he died, he was telling me how he got 0 training for this job, only that his boss said as he was taking him back to the airport for a flight back to Detroit, "I just don't want to hear any trouble. That's all." And Dad said, "That's it?" And he said, "Yep, you're on your own, buddy." So Dad had a challenge on his hands that he was able to shape his way. This was a big job for the biggest corporation in the world. I was 7 and Sue was 11 when we went to Pittsburgh. One of Dad's strengths was that we really didn't know how big that job was or how tough it was. Here's what I remember from those years. Throwing catch in the hilly front yard of the house in Upper St. Clair. Dad always being the assistant coach on my baseball and soccer teams. Lots of work in and out of the house. His pruning back the rhododendron bushes back to just tiny sticks in the front yard produced lots of snickering from Susan and I, but dang it, he wasn't right to do it. It looked terrible, but he said, you watch, they'll be better, and he was right. Nearly constant trips to Bethel Park to spend time with Jane's parents, Sunday trips to Waynesburg to spend time with his parents, Mom and Dad going off to supper club with the Montgomerys and Wrights and other close friends, Christchurch every Sunday, usually with Dad ushering, and Dad leaving early in the morning to attend meetings at the Wesley Institute, helping local children with learning disabilities help navigate their way through schools. This was work that he was very proud of. These were good years, surrounded by family on both sides, and except for Raynor's fight with emphysema, years of good health. And much of the feeling that I have about those years is to Dad's credit. He was the center of this feeling of stability. In 1986, Dad was transferred to St. Louis, which was nearly the mirror opposite of Pittsburgh in those years. Everything was new construction, it was growing in a bustling Midwest city. We were only there 2 years, with Dad heading back to work back again at the Oldsmobile National Office in Lansing in 1988. Susan spent one of her college summers interning at an Oldsmobile office near to Dad's, and they spent those summer months driving back. They would drive in to work together, and then Susan would walk over to electrical engineering where her internship was, and then she would come back over and they would drive home together. And that was a memory that both of them cherished. They had a lot of fun doing that together. In 1991, he started work for Saturn, the new venture that GM had begun with operations south of Nashville. Dad relished this new opportunity, and his job there was a big one too. He was in charge of dealer development, so if you wanted to open a new Saturn franchise, you had to go through Jerry. He was responsible for picking and choosing which dealers got the right to sell Saturns all over the country. GM was trying to be more customer friendly, and Saturn was supposed to be a different kind of car company, so they were right to have Dad join the team. He left Saturn in 1998, and then Mom built their retirement house in Williamsburg and headed off for Virginia. He began the last phase of his career working with Al Finley and running training seminars and consulting with dealers all over the country and all over the world. He loved this work. He set his own schedule and had a lot of freedom. He flew all over the place for this job, to freezing Newfoundland and tropical Bali. He was a natural teacher, and he was teaching about things he knew very well. Dealers would try to hire him, saying they couldn't get along without him and try to stop him from leaving when his time with them was up. And I can see why. It was a lot of fun to be with Jerry in a car dealership. He was really in his element. You could see and feel how comfortable he felt there. He watched everything. And when we would go and buy cars together, on the way home he'd say, "Did you see this? Did you notice that? They're missing an opportunity here. I've told them they need to do this better." He was an unofficial consultant for the local Buick store in Williamsburg after he retired, and he would advise them on all sorts of matters. Almost always it was about treating the customer better. Invest in people, treat people with respect, and keep your word. Finally, the flying got to him. In 2011, he said he couldn't take the Philadelphia airport anymore, and he decided to retire after 49 years in the car business. He was proud to be a career GM man. He kept close with a number of people from his days at Oldsmobile and Saturn. Jerry would keep busy in retirement. When he wasn't keeping up with the latest Steeler news and texting Susan and I about it, he volunteered in several capacities for Colonial Williamsburg. He led walking tours and especially loved giving guided tours of the stables. Here was the natural teacher coming out again. The stable tours reminded him of the farm at Kirby and were really his favorite. I watched him give these tours several times, and he was so good at it. In an age of tiny attention spans, he really captivated children, telling them about how they sheared sheep or shoed horses in the 1700s. Place and tradition was very important to my father. He savored having deep roots in Western Pennsylvania. He loved trying to organize family history and genealogy, especially because he enlisted his little sister Carol in the project. He and Carol made several trips searching for documents and driving around looking at places and walking through cemeteries. He was proud that the Parkinsons had been living in Pennsylvania since the 17th century. Williamsburg was another dream of his. He envisioned it as a magnet for the grandchildren and to have their house be the anchor. Come to Colonial Williamsburg, come to Busch Gardens, come to the beach, we'll host. It was meant to be a cornerstone for new traditions. And for 20 years, the house they built on North Quarter and Kings Mill was exactly that. The gathering place for Christmas and summer trips. It is the special place for the four granddaughters, especially its famous front porch. We all wish he had the chance to enjoy these years more. He had major heart surgery in 2005 to replace a valve, and that bought him about a decade, but there were parts to his heart that just couldn't be fixed. He battled congestive heart failure for about the last 6 years. He fought hard in his own very Jerry way. He never complained. Sue and I found notebooks last year going back to 2015, documenting every fluid ounce going into his body. Every day, pages upon pages of numbers. It must have been utterly exhausting, and yet he never complained. He had lots of problems in the last several years. Sepsis almost got him in 2018. He fell and broke his hip and needed multiple surgeries and eventually a total hip replacement. His kidneys were failing. He had miraculous heart surgery that repaired another valve, an experimental procedure of microsurgery wizardry that still boggles my mind. And in the process, he charmed every nurse and impressed every doctor. It was a lot of medicine, a lot to keep track of, a lot of doctor's appointments and procedures to schedule. And he survived it all. It seemed like there was always something we could do, some path forward. That's why, in the middle of August 2020, when the doctor said that his heart failure had destroyed his liver so badly that there was nothing left to do, it all left us in a state of shock. He had tricked us into thinking he was invincible. Mom and Dad had just celebrated their 58th wedding anniversary, and their dinner then was the last outing they would have together. His last week was very lovely and very hard. He said during his last few days that it's much easier to come into this world than it is to leave it. But everything went as well as anyone could wish for during his last days. He wasn't in any pain. He was at home, in the home that he loved, and he had really good care. Dawn and Peggy were able to make it in to see him, and Carol, who had just had surgery, joined virtually. He was thrilled they came all the way in from Indiana and Kentucky, and he just beamed seeing them. He really, really loved his siblings. The day after their visit, he slipped into a coma. He emerged from it once, long enough for me to have Susan and her two girls, and my two girls, call him. And I watched him listen to all of them on the phone. He frowned when he heard them crying, which was typical of him. Don't be upset by me. But I know he heard their voices. Mom said, "I love you, Jerry." And he looked over at her and gave a big goofy grin. And she asked if he was in any pain, and he shook his head no. And then he slipped back under and was gone the next day. It was such a moving experience to watch that. He heard from all the people who loved him dearly. I remember thinking that week if there was anything I needed to tell him, anything I needed to get off my chest about how I felt about him. I decided there wasn't any. We had said it all to each other, and we knew where we stood. Surrounded by family at home and in no pain, I'm so pleased that that was how he left this world. We have lots of people to thank for that. He had excellent caregivers over the last few years. And of course, he bonded with them. Linnell Curry and Deborah Jones came to the house to help care for him and became favorite people, part of the family. Tamika from Bright Star was phenomenal in his last days, and we were very blessed to have such good help. But Jerry was an easy patient. Neighbors on North Quarter quite literally saved his life on multiple occasions. Phil and Laura Walter and their children helped in ways we can never count or repay. And having Aunt Carol close by in Richmond was also so helpful. Having her on our team, especially with her world-class driving skills, has been more than a comfort, but rather fun. Especially watching her tussle with doctors who she thought could be working a bit harder to help her big brother. We can't thank you all enough for your help and support. Jerry was a kind man. He was a gentle man. He was quiet, but always had a remarkable sparkle in those blue eyes. He was the most optimistic man I've ever met. He was a lot of fun in a swimming pool. He always looked for ways to be helpful. He and Jane's mother were always the tandem to clean up holiday dishes. And later, Sharon joined him on dishwashing duty at the sink. That was their way of participating. He loved German chocolate cake. He loved Thanksgiving leftovers as long as you made fresh mashed potatoes the next day. That was a stipulation. He loved strawberry milkshakes and Mountain Dew for some reason I never figured out. He loved hobnail cookies and Mom's peach cobbler. Pork and sauerkraut on New Year's Day, and a fantastic pork chop really on any day. It didn't have to just be that one. He had wonderful ways of registering happiness, usually about tasty food. He would close his eyes and go, Or he would use a Adopted from Mom's college roommate's father from Texas, he would say, "I ain't mad at nobody." The Steelers. They bought their first big TV to watch the Steelers for a Super Bowl in 1974. And article after article would appear in my email about the Steelers and rumors and grumbles and all kinds of things. And as I mentioned before, Dad and Susan and I had a Steelers texting thread over the last several years, which has usually been full of disappointment and frustration, but still a lot of fun. We made plans to go to Latrobe to see training camp, but his heart kept putting that off. He especially loved tight end Heath Miller, and it breaks my heart that he doesn't know how good this new kid from Penn State is going to be. He had a huge heart. He cared very deeply for those he loved and told them how he felt. He treated everyone with respect. I remember one time after we had dropped Sue off at college, we had got dinner at a Bob Evans in Indiana. And the server there had a pronounced country accent, and I think I made some sort of stupid joke about it because I was 15. And Dad looked at me and said, "It's not a good color on you." And I knew exactly what he meant, and I have never forgotten it. No one was beneath you, and that was a big part of Dad's core. He could get very emotional about music, especially church music. Organs and choirs could make him cry. He would often get involved in raising money at various churches for building big pipe organs. So it's a deep irony that his heart is what failed him. He loved being Poppy. His 4 granddaughters, Katie, Abby, Carly, and Amelia, meant the world to him. He wore his JMU hat when Abby had a big test and his Texas A&M hat when Katie Ann did. My last voicemail from him is asking how Carly is doing. And he took Amelia to Jamestown to help her take a picture there that she entered into a photo contest which won a district award. Poppy's vanilla milkshakes are legendary. And he loved my mother very deeply, the only one who called her Janie. But overall, and uppermost in my mind, is that he was a reliable force. He took great care of Jane's parents when they were in their 90s. He would arrange his travel schedule to come through Pittsburgh often to check on them. He acted far more like a son than a son-in-law when it came to doing what was needed to take care of them. And that meant a great deal to me to watch him take care of them. I was able to be around when Dad was really sick, and I felt that it was my privilege to do so, mostly because of the example he set. In the same way, he developed a strong bond with Jane's Aunt Ruth in her 90s. He made a promise to call her every Saturday at 7 o'clock, and he did so. He set an alarm on his phone and made sure he kept this ironclad appointment. One time, when a visit to Pittsburgh included a Saturday night, he still called her, even though he was sitting across the room from her in her living room, which really made her laugh. This kind of commitment impressed my Abby. When she was in high school, she made a similar commitment to him. If Ruth's calls are Saturday night, she said she was going to call him every Sunday night, and she did. She admired his steadfastness and his reliability, and they had a strong bond. My professional career has me living in Northern Virginia, but driving to upstate New York during the school year. I drive north on Tuesday mornings. Every week, just as I got past Harrisburg and started to climb the plateau, my phone would ring. On my phone, Dad's ringtone is an old-time car horn that goes, "Aruga! Aruga!" And almost exactly the same mile marker, there it would be. He'd say, "Where are you? How's the weather?" Every time. Usually it would ring when I was near Tamaqua, and he'd tell me how I was pronouncing it wrong, and we'd talk about the Steelers in the fall and the Pirates in the spring. He'd ask me whether I was driving back this week on Thursday night or Friday morning, and whatever the answer was, on my return home, there's the car horn. He was thinking about me, and he let me know every time. Those are hard miles now, and will continue to be, because I will very much miss the car horn. That constancy is what I miss most of all. Knowing where you stand and feeling that you are the most important person in the world. That was Dad, and the world needs more people like Jerry Parkinson. He was a good man, a reliable man. He loved being a big brother, a husband, a father, and especially a grandfather. As such, I will miss him constantly. He would want us to honor him by carrying on that example of caring for those you love and telling them and showing them. So we will. I love you and I miss you, Dad.
Good evening. I'm Don Parkinson. I'm Jerry's younger brother. And on behalf of myself and Peg and Carol, we wanted to say a few things about Jerry and his life and what he meant to all of us. I'm sorry we can't do this in person, but it makes sense to be safe at this time with the COVID going around. First of all, I just wanted to say I really miss Jerry. He was a great brother. He was a friend to me and sisters Peg and Carol. Peg and Carol remember how Jerry talked with them before he went off to join the Army on his way to Fort Knox. How he sat there in his uniform and how his gentle demeanor was in contrast to the uniform. He was always a gentleman, with or without a uniform. As the second born, I always looked up to Jerry growing up. We shared a love of cars. We both worked at our dad's dealership. It was in our blood. And after he graduated from Penn State, he went to work for Oldsmobile at General Motors. That was a big deal in the 1960s. It was a big equivalent of going to work for Apple today. And he was successful at Oldsmobile and moved through many positions. Later, I followed him to GM when I joined Pontiac, a sister division. After many moves around the country that he had, that I had, we both ended up in Detroit for meetings. We were on a committee together. And what was really an odd coincidence, there were 8 people on this ongoing committee at GM, and Jerry and I were 2 of the 8. It's a very small world, as it turned out. Jerry is a very focused family man. He was very proud of Jane and Rob and Susan and the girls. His whole world was the family. Every time I talked to him, and we talked frequently, particularly over the last 10 years or so, he was always talking about the family, always. After retiring from GM and Saturn, he could not sit still, and he volunteered at Williamsburg as a docent, then worked in the horse barn. He loved Williamsburg, and he could talk to anyone about anything. He even met a person named Parkinson from England while he was working in the horse barn. That was so typical of Jerry, to strike up conversations like that at any time. He developed a very strong interest in our ancestors. He developed a huge file of the family through Ancestor.com. He even went with Carol to visit churches and graveyards to learn more about our ancestors. On one occasion, he found the land on which our ancestors had lived a couple hundred years ago and took pictures of he and Carol's feet on the land. Peg and Carol speak often about how he cared for them and stayed in frequent contact. He was a dutiful and supportive brother. He was a gentleman. He was a wonderful brother, and we all miss him every day. Thank you.
My name is Laura, and my husband Phil and our 3 children live directly across the street from Jerry and Jane on the North Quarter in Kings Mill. And I would say for the first couple of years, we were friendly, neighborly. But for the next 18, it felt a whole lot more like family. And we took care of each other. They looked out for us. We looked out for them. They were especially nurturing to our youngest daughter, Anna. And we all have fond memories of Jerry and our porch time. He would come out on almost a daily basis and take a seat in his white wicker chair. There's a beautiful white wicker swing on the porch as well. And Neighbors who would walk by, or us as we would come outside, would be welcomed always to come up and have a friendly chat with Jerry. And if someone wasn't up there visiting, he would oftentimes give you a very friendly wave as you drove by. And neighbors have said to me many times how they miss that Mayberry, North Carolina feel of having Jerry wave to them as they drive by. And that has been a fond memory that our neighbors have talked about with Jerry. He always made you feel welcomed. Jerry was calm, kind, genuinely interested in what you were saying to him. He was funny, very smart, loving, and he often spoke about how proud he was of his family. And he would invoke questions that made you want to just come on up the steps and take a seat on the swing and chat and stay a while and just relax. And you never felt in a hurry to leave because he always kept you interested in some kind of conversation. He was a happy man. Jerry lived a full life. And the swing and the white wicker chair continue to adorn that beautiful porch of 117 North Quarter, directly across the street from our house. And it leaves just a sweet, lasting memory of the kind and gentle soul that welcomed anyone and everyone to porch time.
My name is Katie Carter. I'm one of Jerry's granddaughters, and I will be reading a message from Elaine Bachknight, Mimi and Poppy's friends from Pennsylvania. Jane and Jerry moved to Upper St. Clair, a suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a month before my husband and I did. A college friend of Jane's, who knew us both, suggested that we should meet. Brian, my husband, was serving Christ Church, and Jerry and Jane had been married there and were attending that church. Jerry was working for Oldsmobile at the time. Jane and I shopped for the numerous things we needed for our new houses together, causing Jerry to tease us that I encouraged Jane to spend too much of their money. Jerry worked with an Oldsmobile dealer and enabled us to buy a diesel engine station wagon at a very good price. At the time, diesel engines were the energy-conscious thing to have, but the thing I most remember about Jerry is the time he helped me wallpaper our 2-story hallway. We had to hang several strips of paper along the stairway, and the strips were very long and difficult to put into place. Jerry helped me hang the strips and meticulously match the pattern. We did rent a scaffold because there was a staircase also involved, but it was Jerry who made the job not only easier but fun. Jerry truly had the patience of Job as we worked together. That paper was still hanging in the hallway when we sold the house many years later. We have maintained our friendship with Jane and Jerry through their many moves to Michigan, Tennessee, Missouri, and finally to Williamsburg, Virginia. We had a timeshare in Williamsburg and spent 2 weeks in the winter there as a work/study time for Brian. Our daughter and her family, as well as my parents, lived in the Tidewater area of Virginia also, which has provided us additional opportunities to be together over the years when we would go down to visit extended family there. An enjoyable time with Jane and Jerry was always included in those visits.
I'm Abby, one of Jerry's granddaughters, and this is from Wayne Price and Ann Lothar. We always had great respect and admiration for Jerry. Our Aunt Ruth Wall did too. We especially appreciated the affection Jerry showed for Aunt Ruth, especially in her later years. She lived south of Pittsburgh in Finleyville. She passed away in April 2019 at the age of 99. Jerry would call her faithfully every Saturday night. According to Ann, he had an alarm set so he would never forget. Aunt Ruth said they would talk for an hour or so on everything from politics to weather. They were never at a loss for words. She really enjoyed their conversations. They meant a lot to her. We, the family, appreciate Jane's care for Aunt Ruth, too. Jane and Aunt Ruth were both avid readers. When Aunt Ruth could no longer see well enough to read for herself, Jane called her regularly on Wednesdays and read a chapter each week from one of their favorite books. So, Jane, we can only imagine how much you miss Jerry, but we're so happy for you that you're settled in Texas and can enjoy the warmer climate.
I'm Carly Parkinson. I'm one of Jerry's granddaughters. This is a remembrance from Fran Whitney, one of Jane's friends in Williamsburg. There's so much to say about your dad and what a wonderful guy he was. We first met Jerry and Jane through volunteering in Colonial Williamsburg. We became friends and enjoyed going out to eat together at the Williamsburg Lodge for lunch or Bonefish Grill for dinner. When Colonial Williamsburg had their annual volunteer receptions, we would always be sitting with your folks. Jerry enjoyed volunteering in CW and particularly enjoyed doing tours in the stables. Even when he was not doing tours, he would sit and clean horseshoes. I remember one momentous occasion when Queen Elizabeth came to the area for the 400th anniversary of Jamestown. Her entourage rode down Duke of Gloucester Street. Jane and I were sitting on the porch at Weatherburn's Tavern while your dad was on the opposite side of the street taking pictures. When Jerry was at Williamsburg Landing doing rehab, Jim and I would visit him and just sit and chat. Jerry always had good advice, particularly when it came to being in rehab and which one was the very best. When Jim became ill, Jerry would call just to check on him, and it always cheered him up. Before Jerry passed away, he was in Centara Hospital, just down the hall from Jim's room. Now both Jerry and Jim are in a better place, and who knows, maybe they are just sitting, talking, and having a good laugh with each other. From Fran Whitney.
I'm Amelia Carter, one of Jerry's granddaughters. This is a message from Mimi's friend Becky Buckman in Denver, Colorado, that she asked us to share. His wife Jane and I were pen pals from the time we were 11 years old. I was from Georgia and she was from Pennsylvania. I didn't meet her in person until after she was married to Jerry, but Jerry soon became my friend. Also, since Jane and I corresponded so frequently, in the mid-60s I decided to fly to New York City to meet them for the first time. And after having known Jane since 1951, now as adults, our relationship has just grown deeper. Through the years that followed, our families were living close enough to each other in Tennessee and Kentucky that we were able to see each other. Jerry was always too dear to me. When I would call Jane, if he answered, he'd chat with me on the phone. Just like he was my pen pal too. Then he'd turn the phone over to Jane. He never seemed to care how long we talked. Needless to say, I'll miss his genuine love and laughter, but I know that he's talking with angels now, sharing that same love and laughter that was so dear to me. And he's sure that Jane and I are still on the phone quite often. Jerry dear, I'll be catching the bus one day, and my ticket will send me to the corner of heaven where you will be hanging out. Just be patient. I'll be there.
And I have a few remembrances of Dad. One from his longtime business partner and friend, Al Finley, and two from neighbors on North Quarter. The first is from Al Finley. He said, I had the privilege of knowing Jerry for over 40 plus years. However, we came to realize that the Finley-Parkinson connection dated back to the late 1700s in western PA. His ancestral grandfather operated a ferry on the Monongahela River south of Pittsburgh around Belle Vernon, where my ancestral grandfather, Reverend James Finley, started the first Presbyterian church west of the mountains, as they were called back then. Back when Jerry was National Business Development Manager at Olds, I was presenting some material that had been developed for him, but he was not happy with it. So I stayed up late and developed some new material that Monday night, and at breakfast, as he reviewed my ideas, I recall the first thing he said, "Can you teach this stuff?" When he went to Saturn, he called on me to help again, which I did. When he retired, I had the privilege to ask him to help me, and he did. When he retired to Williamsburg, he offered to be a contact for my granddaughter when she went to William and Mary. It is very seldom that I do not think about him. The most humorous thing that I recall was that he was seldom speechless. But one day we were in Dallas doing a financial training session, and it was his birthday. At the afternoon break, I had the hotel bring in the biggest piece of chocolate cake for him, where the group wished him a happy birthday, and he never let me forget it. And finally, we have two from neighbors at North Quarter. One is next door. Tiffany Gaisel said, I have fond memories of sitting on the porch swing talking to Jerry while he sat in the chair with his newspaper. And he was helpful in giving me a ride to work when our car wouldn't start. And there are many other little moments. And finally, this last one is from Anna Walter. You heard from her mother, Laura, earlier. This is from Anna, who wanted to share this about who she also called Poppy. Where do I begin? I lived across the street from the Parkinsons for my entire life. I'm 23 years old now. My time in Williamsburg is marked by numerous visits to the Parkinsons' house. Sometimes these were planned, and I would call ahead of time to ask if I could come over, and other times they were unplanned. Sometimes I would see Poppy sitting in his chair on the porch reading a book while I was walking down the street. When he saw me walking, he would wave, and I waved back, and as I made my way to the porch swing, where I would sit for about 20 minutes talking with him, before we decided it was time to go inside and chat with Mimi. Often the three of us sat in the living room and listened to Mimi's stories about her and Poppy's lives. Everything from all the places where they lived in the U.S. to stories about their children and grandchildren. Poppy was pretty quiet when Mimi would share these stories, except for when she needed help remembering a detail from a story. Poppy had such a sharp mind, and he always helped her fill in the gaps. I visited the Parkinsons a countless number of times, and it looked the same every time. Hours would pass before the phone rang for my mom to telling me that I needed to come home for dinner, and I was always sad, but I knew I would be back soon. Poppy was always a patient and calming presence, and his smile lit up the room. He was like a grandfather to me and made me feel like one of his granddaughters. I'm so thankful for the time I was able to spend with Poppy, and will never forget the time I spent with him on his porch. My mother Jane, sister Susan, and I thank you for attending this celebration of Jerry's life. Jane has recently moved from Williamsburg to Georgetown, Texas, to be closer to Susan, Pete, and their girls, and to enjoy the lovely warm weather. Since she has a new address and new phone number, please reach out to either Susan or I, and we will let you know the updated information. My email address is rparkinson27@gmail.com, and Susan's email is spka1997@yahoo.com. And Mom's email address remains jerryp1816@aol.com. Thank you, and have a good night.